The room was dimly lit, filled with laughter and the soft tinkling of glasses. The air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't quite define, a mix of excitement, danger, and possibility. I had dressed for the occasion in a way that made me feel confident and alluring, but I had no idea just how much that night would change everything. It all started innocently enough, just a gathering of friends, or so I thought. My husband, Mark, and I had been married for 7 years. We were part of a tight-knit group of couples who often spent time together. We laughed at the same jokes, shared countless memories, and occasionally confided in one another about the ups and downs of marriage. I thought I knew everyone in that room inside and out, or at least I thought I knew Mark. But as the evening wore on, I began to notice things. Glances exchanged across the room lingered just a moment too long. Laughter felt a bit too intimate. The way Josh, one of Mark's friends, let his hand rest on my lower back as he passed, just long enough for me to notice. Then came the suggestion. "Let's shake things up," said Claire, one of the wives. Her voice was playful, teasing, but her eyes gleamed with mischief. "How about we try a little experiment?" Mark chuckled, his arm casually draped over my shoulder, but there was an unfamiliar edge to his tone. "What kind of experiment?" Claire grinned, her red lipstick catching the light. "Well, we've all known each other for years. I think it's safe to say we trust one another, right?" A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. She continued, her tone conspiratorial. "What if we spent the night in someone else's shoes or someone else's arms?" The room fell silent. My heart skipped a beat. Was she serious? I glanced at Mark, expecting him to laugh it off or shut it down, but he didn't. Instead, he met my eyes, and in that moment, I saw something I'd never seen before: curiosity. "That's a bold suggestion," he said evenly. Josh chimed in, his voice smooth. "It's just a game, no pressure, no strings. Just a chance to see the world from a different perspective." I opened my mouth to protest, to say something, anything, but Claire cut me off. "It's just for fun," she said. "Besides, it's not like we're doing anything permanent. Just one night. What do you say?" My pulse raced. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into something dark and uncharted. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, but then Mark spoke. "I think it could be interesting." I whipped my head around to look at him. Was this the same man I'd been married to for 7 years? The man who hated surprises and prided himself on being grounded, steady, predictable? The others began to chime in, their voices blending into a chorus of agreement. Before I knew it, I was nodding along too. I didn't know why. Maybe it was the wine, the atmosphere, or the unshakable feeling that saying no would change things even more than saying yes. And just like that, the rules were laid out. Everyone would draw a name from a bowl, and for the rest of the night, we'd pair up with whoever we picked. "It's just a talk," Claire said with a wink. "Get to know each other better. No obligations." But the look in her eyes told me there was more to the story. Mark drew first. His hand hovered over the slips of paper for what felt like an eternity before he finally picked one. He unfolded it slowly, his face betraying nothing. Then he looked up, and his eyes locked onto Claire's. My stomach dropped. The room seemed to shift. The moment Mark's gaze met Claire's, it was subtle. Just a glance, a barely perceptible curve of her lips, but it felt seismic. A strange mix of jealousy, curiosity, and something I wasn't ready to admit churned in my stomach. Heat rose in my cheeks as the others took their turns drawing names one by one. They unfolded their slips of paper, exchanging subtle, knowing glances. I hadn't even touched the bowl yet, my fingers trembling at the thought of what or who might be waiting for me. Then it was my turn. The room went quiet as I reached in, my heart pounding in my chest. The crumple of paper in my hand sounded deafening in my ears. When I opened it, the name stared back at me like a challenge. "Josh." I looked up, and there he was, leaning against the edge of the couch, his dark eyes glinting with amusement and something deeper, something primal. He raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "Looks like we're partners for the evening," he said, his voice low and smooth. I tried to play it cool, shrugging as though it didn't matter, but the truth was, my heart was racing, and every nerve in my body felt like it was on fire. Claire clapped her hands, breaking the silence. "All right, everyone, let's spread out. Get comfortable. Remember, this is just for fun. No judgments, no expectations. Just explore." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Couples began to drift off, some heading to different corners of the room, others disappearing into adjacent spaces. I glanced at Mark, one last time, hoping to find reassurance in his eyes, but he was already walking toward Claire. His hand brushed against hers as they moved to the far side of the room. I felt a pang of something sharp and bitter. Was it jealousy, betrayal, or was it excitement? Josh's voice pulled me back to the moment. "Shall we?" He extended a hand, and for a moment I hesitated, but then I took it, allowing him to guide me to a quieter corner near the bar. "So," he said, pouring 2 glasses of wine, "how are you feeling about all this?" His tone was casual, but his eyes told a different story. They searched mine, probing, teasing, daring me to be honest. I took a sip of the wine, feeling the warmth of it spread through me. "Honestly, I'm not sure. This is different." "Different can be good," he said, leaning in slightly. His voice dropped a notch, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes stepping outside of the ordinary is exactly what we need." I couldn't tell if it was the wine or the intensity of his gaze, but my defenses were crumbling. The space between us felt charged, electric. He reached out, his fingers brushing against mine as he took the glass from my hand. It was such a small gesture, but it felt intimate, deliberate. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "I've always thought you were intriguing." I blinked, caught off guard. "Intriguing?" He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. "You have this energy about you, like there's so much more beneath the surface, just waiting to be discovered." I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. But before I could say anything, he leaned in closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, have you ever let yourself be truly seen?" The question hit me like a bolt of lightning. I didn't know how to answer, but before I could overthink it, Josh placed a hand gently on my shoulder. His touch was firm yet comforting. "It's okay," he said, his thumb brushing against my collarbone. "You don't have to say anything. Just be here in this moment." And for the first time that night, I let myself breathe. Josh's hand lingered on my shoulder, the warmth of his touch spreading through me. I could feel my breath catch as he leaned in closer, his eyes locking onto mine. The air between us felt heavier, charged with something unspoken, yet undeniable. "You're tense," he murmured, his voice low and soothing. "You don't have to be." I let out a nervous laugh, trying to mask the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. "Can you blame me? This whole night feels surreal." He smiled, a slow, confident smile that made me feel as if the rest of the room had melted away. "Surreal can be good," he said, his fingers brushing lightly against my arm. "Sometimes it's exactly what we need to wake up to parts of ourselves we've been ignoring." The way he said it felt layered, like he wasn't just talking about the moment. It was about something deeper, something personal. Despite myself, I found that I couldn't look away. He reached for the glass of wine, taking a small sip before offering it back to me. His hand brushed against mine as I took it, and the slight contact sent a shiver down my spine. "You know," he said, leaning back slightly, but still close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, "there's something about you that's always intrigued me." I tilted my head, raising an eyebrow. "Intrigued? How?" He chuckled softly, his voice like velvet. "You have this quiet confidence, like you're in control of every room you walk into, even when you don't realize it. It's captivating." I felt a blush rise to my cheeks, and I couldn't help but laugh. "You're laying it on thick, aren't you?" "Not at all," he replied, his tone earnest. I mean every word. There was a vulnerability in the way he said it, an openness that caught me off guard. It was disarming, and for the first time that evening, I felt myself relax. I glanced across the room and saw Mark with Claire. The two of them were talking in hushed tones. Her hand rested on his arm, her body leaning into his, and something about the way he smiled at her sent a pang through my chest. Josh followed my gaze, his expression unreadable. "Does it bother you?" he asked softly. I hesitated, unsure how to answer. "I don't know. Maybe." He nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "It's okay to feel conflicted. This isn't exactly a normal situation." "No," I said, letting out a small, nervous laugh. "It's definitely not." He shifted closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "But sometimes stepping out of the normal is where we find what we didn't know we were missing." His words hung in the air, and I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and fear. My heart was racing, my mind a jumble of thoughts and emotions I couldn't untangle. And then, without thinking, I leaned in just slightly, barely enough to close the space between us, but it was enough for him to notice. Josh smiled, his eyes flickering with something that looked like both understanding and anticipation. He reached up, his hand brushing against my cheek. His touch was gentle but deliberate. "See," he murmured, his lips just inches from mine. Sometimes all it takes is one moment. Josh's hand on my cheek was warm, grounding me in a moment that felt surreal. His eyes searched mine as if waiting for permission, a sign that I was willing to step into this uncharted territory. My breath hitched as I felt his thumb gently graze my jawline, the sensation sending a ripple of warmth through me. "It's okay," he said softly, his voice low and reassuring. "You don't have to say anything. Just be here." I didn't trust myself to speak. The world around us seemed to blur, the murmurs of conversation and laughter fading into the background. All I could focus on was him, his presence, his intensity, the way his eyes held mine, pulling me into a place I wasn't sure I wanted to leave. And then, almost instinctively, I leaned in. It wasn't a bold movement, just a small shift that brought me closer to him, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his breath against my skin. He didn't hesitate. His hand slid from my cheek to the back of my neck, his fingers threading gently through my hair as he closed the remaining distance between us. His lips brushed mine softly at first, tentative, as if testing the waters. My heart pounded in my chest, a mix of adrenaline and something deeper, something I hadn't felt in a long time. I responded without thinking, tilting my head slightly to deepen the kiss. It was slow and deliberate, a quiet exploration that seemed to ask 1,000 questions without speaking a single word. The world around us disappeared entirely. I wasn't thinking about Mark or the others, or the implications of what we were doing. For the first time that evening, I let myself be present, let myself feel, without overanalyzing or second-guessing. Josh pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine, as he exhaled slowly. "You okay?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, my eyes still closed as I tried to steady my breathing. "Yeah," I managed to say. "I'm okay." His lips curled into a small, knowing smile. Good. The moment felt fragile, like a bubble that could burst at any second, but instead of feeling regret or hesitation, I felt alive, like something dormant inside me had just woken up.